All right, today we're going to go into chapter 14. It's going to have us working with package design. All right.
Yay, package
The,
design!
the nice thing as we go and we start to get working with package design, though, is it is something that gets a little bit away from what we think about it just as the flat designs.
I think I know what we have to draw. I think I what we're doing. The front of the package,
Yes,
side of the
package,
package,
we'll
back of the
see.
package.
We'll see. But the big thing with it is we do start getting into something, looking at designs that aren't presented flat. Because even when we get into digital presentations, web designs, multimedia, that type of stuff, we're still presenting it flat. It's going flat on a screen, whether it's a smartphone, whether it's a tablet, whether it's a computer. But this gives us an opportunity to go into a different area. So really we're going to start to look at and understand what is the purpose of a package design. We're going to go in and we're going to start to look at what do we need to do when it comes to thinking about what goes into it. So what we need to consider as we go in and begin to design our packages. Start looking at sustainability. So what are we using material-wise for it? Are we using something that can be reused? Start looking at even from the sake of packaging that we get that's shipping now. How many shipping things come to us that are designed that if you have to return it, you go right back in that same envelope as well. And then also we're going to start looking at what goes into the role. We start looking at this is an audio CD package. Now most of the stuff that we buy right now, we start talking about what goes into audio type CDs. If you think back when you bought audio CDs though, the same type of stuff still goes into what we're developing. We're still doing cover art. We're still putting these together. Right now, even with the sake of records coming back out, I don't know how many people in here, anybody in here own a record player now? So records are coming back. I mean, they're steaming back just because of the authentic sound that you have with it.
You know, like vinyls are coming back
Right.
in like a craze because a lot of bands are starting to make vinyls for their music.
They go back to, when you look at it from a longevity standpoint, the fact that you have records that can go and your records can just last and last and last and last. So we'll look at it kind of just in the way of the audio packaging. So what is the purpose of packaging design? To sell you something?
Well, more so to sell you on the product.
Right, so it's the same thing. It's a promotion. So when we go through and we start getting our package design together, it is designed to be a promotion. So it's just like if we're working with a poster, if we're working with a book jacket, anything that we hear, we're trying to promote something. Except for when we go through and we start working with the packaging, and the packaging has a function. So when we look at a poster, it's there, it's a promotion, but there isn't any true function to it. So when we go through and we start to work with it being functional, when we say that, we're talking about that it goes in and creates something. So it encases some sort of a product or serves out some sort of a function. So when we go through and start to think about how do we go about closing up the package, how do we go about then turning around and opening the package, all that has to be thought of. We get into the overall function with it. So we're dealing with a pour spout and a flap to it. Think like the milk carton inside of schools. You go through there and you know how you open that to pour it out, to drink from it, when I put a straw into it. So starting to think about how is the package that you're putting around the product going to actually serve its function and be part of it. So really we get into the package design. Our package design is a complex process. So we go through and start to build it. So it's the strategic planning and designing of the form, the structure, and the appearance of that product's package. So as you start to think about what is going to be a part of it, so think about candy bars. Hershey bars have changed a little bit. In fact, originally it was the foil, and then they had the wrap around it. Now the design is there to where it's all one piece, but it still has that same look to it. So as we start to think about it, also when we go into sustainability, it's not only that, it's how are we going to sustain that design idea as it continues through and we start looking at the process. So what's there? What information has to be on that? You know, like good nutritional information has to fit on that package somewhere. The ingredients are on there. We go through and we start thinking about how is it branded. That's going to go into there as well. So we have to really think about how do we fit all this stuff on there but still maintain function. So when we go through, we start thinking about, you know, what do package designers need to know? Well, they need to know all of the stuff that we've already talked about when it comes to designers, graphic designers, visual designers. All of that stuff is part of it, but we also have to get into other areas. You know, when we look at construction and technical factors, what is it that we need to go through to build this? How do we actually go about building this? What are the actual processes that exist out there? Depending on the product, what plays into that? Food products, how do we, of course, protect them from any type of intrusion on anything? Prior to starting to teach, I was interviewing that with a company that did all packaging for batteries. And with that, they had a duty-free warehouse even, so stuff would come in from overseas in bulk. And with that, the packaging is designed. They get all the batteries come out of the bulk packaging and go into the other packages that were designed for it. They get boxed right back up. And technically, they've never landed on American soil. They go right back into the box, and then they'll ship back out overseas. Or if they do continue on to the U.S., then they deal with duty and import tax and everything on that amount of product. So you start looking at those things. How does that play into it as we start to look at what's there? What processes are there? We start thinking about clamshells. We start talking about blister packs. We start thinking about different ways that food's packaged. Are you using part of the packaging to make the product? So like instant oatmeal, you can dump the oatmeal out, but then there's a line on the bag you can fill with water, so you have the right amount of water in there. Cupo noodles. Anybody eat cupo noodles? Ramen, I mean, it's the same. So you go through and start looking at the ones that actually have the cup included with it. You look at freezer meals, same thing. They're packaged in a container, allows you to throw it in the microwave. You eat it right out of there and you throw it away, so you're not dirtying another dish.
It's like the 60-second meat by the store.
Right.
Convenience store.
Yeah, I mean that's what they're designed for there. So they're there so that we can use them. But package designer sat down and put those together and decided this is what it needs to look like. This is how it needs to work.
But
We go,
just like stab a couple holes in the package.
right, but that's all part of that process then. So when we start getting in there, we start looking at it from a standpoint of technical factors. We have to look at what do we need to have on there. If it's something that's designed to go in a microwave, we probably shouldn't have any foil backing on it, right?
Or don't put it in an oven.
So there's a lot of things we think about. If it is going to the oven, there's even containers then that can go in. Yes, foil is probably the most common one that can go into the oven, but there are other materials as well that can go in there that will withstand the heat. That gets into our materials and manufacturing. So you start to learn about materials. You start thinking about whatever product it is you're being asked to create the packaging for. You need to understand those materials. Along with it as well as if you are going into package design and you are starting to think about dealing with processes such as thermal forming where you heat up the plastic and sucks it down over a mold, where do you usually go ahead and create that mold? For example, the company that was doing the battery packaging, what we used they were metal rods that were the same diameter as a battery. And all you end up doing with those is you figured out how you wanted them to go together to be able to work with it, and then essentially you weld them together. By welding, we use liquid weld. If it's in a process that's not going to get hot enough to cause hot glue to melt, you just run a nice big bead of hot glue between them, and they all will stick together. You want that hard, you set it in the mold, it heats the plastic, sucks it down, that comes off. Goes into another one that actually comes down and cuts it to the size that you need them for, and then you just start stacking them, and then the batteries will come into play. The batteries start going in there, you close them up, put them in the press, seal them, and it just keeps running its way through. So you start looking at, those materials. What's the manufacturing process? So when I talk about, being interested in stuff and going out and looking at things, the carries right on into package design. So don't be afraid to go into places and see how stuff works. I mean, you literally can go to some businesses and say, hey, I'm studying design. I know that you do this at this facility. I'd like to see what the process is. And a lot of places will let you just come in. They'll take you right on through it. Print houses will let you go in and see, how the production runs. So don't be afraid to go in and talk to people about it. Safety. So with safety, we should start thinking about the packaging, the processes, the materials, what happens with the materials. Safety would go back to the whole foil concept. Foil on something you're planning to put in the microwave is not a good idea. Display. When you design the package, how is this ultimately going to be displayed in the store? If it's designed to be upright, then you have to think about the base. How's it going to sit? Make sure that we equal out the weight distribution on it so they don't want to fall over. Is it designed to have a little hanger tag to it? Okay, if it's got a hanger tag, then how much space does it need on the shelf when we go to hang it? That we can start to break down. If you don't want it super wide, if it's going on a hanger tag, if it's going on a hanger tag and it's super wide, you're going to need 2 hooks. Now, if it needs 2 hooks, it's going to double the space it's going to take hanging up there, so it impacts everything else that's around it. Is it going into a point of purchase display? So you're going to have a piece of cardboard that folds up and sits on a shelf to where things are set in there so that we can see them. Think about how you would take multiples of your products and put them on display for purchase. Recycling. This is going to continue to keep getting pushed and pushed and pushed. Are the materials that you're choosing to use, are they recyclable? Can this be made out of a recycled material? So what is it that we're going through to use to build them? If you are building working with a product itself, is there anything that's part of what you're building, what you're using that can't be recycled? When it can't be recycled, I mean recycled in traditional means. Do you have someplace special to go that you need to put these things so that you can recycle something that's out of them? Break the product down, pull the different minerals out of them, and reuse it. Regulatory management. Is there anything that you're using, that you're designing with that's regulated? And also start to look at the quality standards. How do you maintain the quality of the packaging that you are producing? And the last one on there we start looking at is printing. So as we go through and we start to think about what is it that's going on there, how are you going to be dealing with the printing of the graphics and that's on there. So we carry through all of those things. Now as we go in and we start to work with packaging design, we are still dealing with a brand. Now, it's possible that you may be working with a company that is new, that doesn't have any extensive branding. Many years ago, my classes here, we worked through with a company that makes a throwable microphone. It's called the Cue Ball. And with that, the very early versions of it, literally the guy made this thing out of a dodgeball, and there was a mounting thing inside of it with a windscreen over it, but a microphone mounted inside of this so that you could sit there and you could talk, and then when someone wanted to answer a question and stuff, you could literally throw the ball to them. It had the newer ones functioned so much better. The early ones would still have popping to them. So, I mean, if you went to throw it, there were still times it would go through and then you'd catch it and there'd be a little bit of a pop to it. But it plugs right into a computer. So that way you can throw it out, but the microphone is wireless, but it's got the receiver that's there. So when we did that, there was no branding to it. He literally sent me some images, sent me the logo, and said, we're looking for packaging for it. And my class sat down and we did a bunch of package designs to him, and we sent those off to him, and he ultimately chose one and used that for a little while just at the very start of it. So with that, we didn't have any heavy branding to go off of. A lot of times, though, you're going to end up working with companies that do have heavy branding. So you have to think about how does all of that go in, how are you going to go ahead and integrate this product into the existing branding and marketing strategies. The big thing as we go and we start to work with it, is it easier to work with it with a current branding or without? Really, they both have their own unique struggles to them. When you have no branding, you have nothing to base it off of. There's even times you're going to go into a company and they won't even have their logo solidified yet. They're like, oh, we're using like 3 different logos right now because it's just kind of the way it's worked. So with that, if you get into a company and start dealing with packaging and it's a brand new company, brand new product, it's possible that you're going to be pulled in as part of the group that's really building what is going to be their branding guidelines moving forward. If you have something where it's already well established, well, in this case, you're going to have the logos given to you. There's going to be visual identity there. There's going to be additional signage that exists. You may have designs that are on gift cards. So there's a lot of different things that we're actually going to go through and be using. Well, there's transportation involved. So they have something that's on a bus. They have stuff that's designed on their vehicles. So as you start to think about that, whichever one you end up with, one that is well established or one that is new, start thinking about what exactly is going to play into that and how all of those pieces are ultimately going to fit together. So we go through and we start to look at some different things. So this here is package design. So we see on here the and shine. So we start to look at how are we going to go through and start to build what's here. So we're going to see it there when we start looking at what they have as their logo there. It's kind of like this sun idea with the plus sign in the middle of it. As you go through and you start to design and come up with an idea and a concept, it is important that you go through and you at least start to think about how am I going to have variations in this. If this goes on, now in something like this, you know right away that you're going to have multiple products. So we know that we have, in this case, we start going through and we start dealing with what do they have for their overall products. Mouthwash, shampoo, conditioner, body lotion, foot scrub. I'm guessing that appears to be sunscreen or something. But, so when you start to look at those, we know that these products all exist for this. So how do we go in and add to it? How are we going to make these consistent, yet different? So you go through and you start to look at it based upon color choices. Look at how they're working with the logo itself, color, and using the word and. So those are working with each other. Same thing, so we go over here, we see how they start to play with this. That's the idea that first comes up. We want to make sure that as we go through and we design things, that what's recognizable is there. How are they going to know our product? In this case, they're comfortable enough having just the sun with the plus being the key thing on the lower items that are there, also on the caps that are what most likely is lip balm. So as we start to think about that, how do we go through and use those things? Can we get away with using the logo alone? Maybe. It took Nike, I forget how many years, 7 years or something like that before they ever used the swoosh without the word Nike embedded in it. So as you start to do that, that's just all deals with the market analysis to understand what's going on, what do they know about it, do they understand the product, they understand what you do. But we can see really as we start to look at these different ways in which they're treating it. The top one's very much the white bottle, simple color, designs to them, repeating as we start to look at the shape. As we go through and we start looking at the bottle. There's a reason why Coca-Cola has a patent on their bottle. Because it's an object, it's recognizable, and they use it in many different ways now. So we start to see the silhouette in that front, yes.
Yeah, like some designs for like products are just like logos nowadays. They get more simple and simple as time goes on.
So as we start to look at them, it's the fact that we're looking at driving home the recognition from it. You know, the processes that are available to us just get more and more complex, but at the same time, we can go back to simplifying things. We start looking at stuff that's simplified. We start looking at the cost. We know that budget drives a lot of what we do. So the same thing happens even in package design. We start getting back to using things that are off the shelf. You start to see that you can go into a store and people make similar products, and all of a sudden you notice that they're all packaged in similar shaped packages because, again, it's a cost standpoint. You go look at light bulbs. Doesn't matter what the light bulb design is for the bulb itself and what feature it has, most of them come in the same style of packaging. So we go through and we start thinking about our strategy. What happens if we go through and we have something that's part of a much larger brand. We need to make sure that this design goes through and works with that. Again, depending on where it is that you're working at, you may find that you have a larger group that you're working with. And then with that time, you may have somebody who's in charge of the branding, and you have to take the product in and show them and explain what's there, and they look at it and go, I don't like the way that you did this because it doesn't match up with the way that we do our work. We need to change this to look more like that, and then we'll be okay as we start to move forward. So as we go through to work with that, larger places are going to have people with that. The situation that we worked with Q-Ball, we literally were working with the owner of the company. He's the CEO. He works in production. He was doing most of everything at that time. At that point, it's a little bit different because then you just go and say, what do you think? I like it. Keep going. So you're not really dealing with anything outside of that. So now any other text that may go on there that promotes benefits and stuff like that, obviously that probably goes through a legal team before it goes through as well. But the overall goal that we have when we get into here is to focus on the overall strategic platform. That's the core of it. That's what we're trying to do. That's our strategy. Everything is built around that. So we go through and we start to think, what is our tactics? How are we moving forward with this? That goes into that area. So we go through and we start looking at our line of products. What happens if we have a bunch of different products?
You're gonna have different variants of packages.
Well, with that, so yes, you're going to move into some things. So we go through and start to think about it. What all is in there? What are the products? What are we trying to focus on? What is the factor of it? Are they all going to look exactly the same? No. So when we go through and start to think about how are we going through to work with them, is that we start looking at the line of beverages. So with this, they start talking about flavors, diet, regulars, caffeine, caffeine-free. But start thinking through some of the products that you know. You can get into the ones you can start to think about, Pepsi. How does Pepsi go through and work with Pepsi, Diet Pepsi? How do they work with Cherry Pepsi? How do they go through and work with, what else do they have? I mean, if you're, like, you get into Coke, I'm more familiar with Cokes, like caffeine-free, Coke, Coke Zero. So
all their little buddies, like Sprite.
Right, and that's not even getting out into those yet. So we go through and we focus on the product itself. So we go through and we're thinking about regular Coke. So when we start thinking about regular Coke, Coke has a look to it. It has a color choice to it. But keeping that consistent to go to Coke Zero. So what's the change between Coke and Coke Zero? What happens when we go to Diet Coke? From Diet Coke to caffeine-free Coke to Diet Caffeine-free Coke. So as we start looking at all of those, that's how you maintain one line. But then what else does Coke make? Well, Coke also makes Sprite, and then they have Cherry Sprite, and then they have that Ginger Sprite.
I never heard of Cherry Sprite at all. No. Really? Yeah, I drink a lot of Sprite, but I've never heard of Cherry Sprite.
Yeah, so they make a Cherry Sprite. Cherry Sprite, when COVID hit, has been near impossible to find. So now I've had to fill my vending machine with Cherry 7-Up.
I heard all the 7-Up Mountain Dew flavors.
So you have that. But that can break it out, because then inside of Coke you also have Mellow Yellow. And then you get into, which one is Coke's root beer? Are they mug?
Mugs.
I don't remember which one Coke is, but Coke has a root beer as well.
It's like a joke, but it's funny.
So when you go through and you start to look at those, the difference between Dr. Pepper and Mr. Pibb. Mr. Pibb, I believe, is also a Coke product. Barks. There we go.
Oh, that's disgusting.
Barks root beer is really good.
Not my cup of tea.
But I can't say much because my vending machine has A&W in it. Because that's the classic root beer. But when we go through and start to think about this, we're looking at that line Coke, 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 all the different variations of Coke, and then you have the other products that Coke makes. So how do those all go into there? Now, as we break through, yes, we're really presenting these to somebody else. Like, we're not marketing the Mellow Yellow to the same group that we're doing Coke. There's a big difference between how they deal with Pepsi and how they deal with Mountain Dew. So we start to think about that even as we get into the packaging. How is it going to go in there and play with that? What is the strategy of it based upon This was created for that, so that's what you want to go through and do with it. So what's going to happen as you go through and you start to work with it is we're going to deal with that brand architecture. So that's going through to say, okay, we've got at the very top is Coke. As we move down from there, we start looking at the other products. How do they filter down? We also go through and we start to look at what are they all about. So that goes into the actual form of it or the flavor differentiations to them. So you have to start to think about these as two kind of separate tracks. There's the Coke flavors and differentiations. So your vanilla Coke, your, like I said, your Coke Zeros, your caffeine-free Cokes, your Diet Cokes, your Diet caffeine-free Cokes, your Cokes with lime, your Cokes with lemon, your Cokes with orange, your Cokes with whatever, grapes.
Grenadine.
With what?
Into grenadine.
Yeah, your Coke with a hint of grenadine. Whatever you're running with over there, those are all the different flavor differentiations that exist. You need to at least be aware of those as you're going through and you're building them.
My mom, every time she we go to a restaurant or something, if they allow, she always gets like Mountain Dew grenadine, Coke, Diet Coke grenadine.
Yeah, it just adds that slight like cherry flavor to it. And that's really what you're getting out of it. And then the identity standards. So what is it has to be in there to, of course, go through and identify the product and also that people are expecting to be involved with it. Now, as we go through, we start with packaging design. We hit a little bit on this. We start talking about all the information that has to actually be on there. So we start looking at from regulation standpoints. So with that, we have to start looking at industry and federal regulations. What are those regulations? What is the mandatory information that has to be on there?
What does the plus part mean?
The what?
It says regulations plus.
Regulations plus, it's just everything that you have to think of. So regulations plus the other things, it's design issues, printing specs, structural specs,
What is the other thing?
functional data. The second line that you see here on the slide, we'll get to that here in a moment. So the federal regulations, so what mandatory information has to be on there? Your nutritional information. That whole breakdown has to be on there, the ingredients that are inside of there. So they have to be included. So as you go through and you start to think about what am I designing, what's the size of this package, that's also part of the reasons why when we start looking at certain variations in the packaging, you look at it and go, wow, we could actually cut the size of this packaging and the materials required by 60% if we would change the size of this. And then they go, yeah, but how do we fit all of the information that we are required to have on there on that small package? Then what ends up happening is if you have a smaller design for something, you then have to make a larger package to hold the smaller package so that you can fit the information that's on them. So as you go through and you start to look at it, you start thinking like a Snickers bar. With that, how much information is on there, trying to get in there. And it's even gotten to the point where strategically, as they make the pack and how it goes through, and it has the wrapper comes around and it's got the little fold over piece that sits on the back of it. Well, that's strategically done because you can take that when you fold that over so you can look at, they're printing the nutritional information and the ingredients on that piece that it's just all it literally is that's how it presses it together to glue it so that the package is closed. But they've made those flaps. Those flaps used to be tiny because they didn't need the space for it all, and that was material. But then what ends up happening is they need more space to be able to fit the regulatory information on there. So all of a sudden that flap goes from being a half an inch to being more like an inch because it's there, allows them to print on both sides of that and use it. So those are things we have to think of. The additional things we have to go into then, we start thinking about sustainability design issues. So how am I using this? Where am I sourcing my materials from? How sustainable is this? It might be really neat to go through and be able to work with a product that's a natural product and stuff like that, but can I get what I need from that? When I'm done with it, what can I do with it? What's going to happen with it? A lot of people go through and they start to push, well, what's the amount of time it would take for something like this to naturally break down? How long does it take? And they're not going to sit there and, some places may put one out for study, but you're not going to take a Snickers thing and put it in the ground, like, all right, I'm going to watch this and see how long it takes for it to disappear. No, they know the material that's on there, and they know how long it takes to degrade if it gets moved to a landfill. It's kind of like plastics. There's a lot of stuff going on with plastics now, looking at using alternative sources for plastics. So we can use soy-based plastics that once they go and essentially hit the ground, what ends up happening with them is they will break down, they biodegrade way faster than anything else. We start looking at sustainability based on foam, styrofoam, the original styrofoam stuff. You know, the life of it forever. I mean, you get those little beads of styrofoam and they never disappear. But how can we go through and work with other packaging? Again, it's plant-based type packaging that allows it to break down. That's the big thing. Soy for a while there. I'm not sure what soybean price is now, but soy for a while there. Soybeans were being used for all kinds of stuff. Some soy packaging. So with that, you saw an uptick in the cost of soybeans because people were using that to create alternative packaging materials because they naturally broke down. So as we start to look at what can you do with stuff, even experiment. What's something else that I could be using? What would be used as a process for this? Do I have to use virgin lumber that allows me to come in? It's never been used for anything. We're going to split it up. We're going to make a packaging. Or can I use recycled materials? You know, for a long time there, we post-consumer recycled material. You saw those hitting into products at 15%. Now it's not uncommon. You'll see something that's made out of 90% post-consumer recycled materials. And it's something that quickly goes back in and breaks itself back down again. So we start looking at that. Printing specs. So as we start to look at what is it we need to be able to do to print, it goes back to that Snickers wrapper. We're expanding out the size of the space that we have on something that's what would normally be considered a non-functional piece, other than the fact that it closes the package. Now it becomes a printing surface. So how can we use that? So looking at things that's, with wrappers that are on them. We're talking about the band wraps that go around something. Can we use that to go through and help with it? If so, what's the added cost for that? Now we're printing an extra material and there's an extra process in the assembly for it. So how does that play into what is there? Structural specs. Does the package have to have some sort of structural capability to it? Other than, of course, maintaining it. If we go through and we start thinking about how do they ship Snickers bars? They typically they're all shipped in a box. They move them and they put them into a box. And that's because when we look at it, so they design a box, which is part of the packaging design, because some of those boxes then also fold up and you can move them around and that'll allow it to sit right on the shelf. Other ones are designed, you just rip it open, you take the individual candy bars out, and that's how you work with it. So they're shipped in a box. So therefore, does the wrapper itself need any structural capability? No. So that's how we have to start to think about this. It's not just the individual product, it's also how are we moving this. So how is this going to become part of the commerce? As we put it out there, how are we going to ship this? If we're talking about something that needs to actually maintain its own integrity as we ship it, then we have to build that into that overall package design for it. That's why you'll find some things that show up to your house if you order through Amazon. I don't know how many people order through Amazon, but they stop at my house every day. So with that, what are you ordering? Some things do come in a box. Other items show up, and all they've done is just slap the shipping label right on the top of the product, right?
Or they put it in like a packaging.
They may put it in a regular shipping box, but I know I get stuff rather regularly that they've just simply taken the shipping label, has been slapped right on the outside of the package, and it just shows up just like that.
Some of them just ship in those like bag packages.
They do bags, that works through as well. If you start looking at bags, what's the bag relying on for the product to not be damaged? Bubbles, but they're relying back on the original packaging. So if you see it in a bag, it's in a bag because the product itself has been packaged in a product or in a package that is able to sustain the wear and tear of shipping. So it goes back to, again, if I just go back to the Snickers bar, or you go to even one that's even more fragile, just go back to just a Hershey bar that can break into all its little pieces. What would happen if we took a Hershey bar and we threw it in a bag and shipped it that way? It's going to show up and they're going to be like, Hershey's little bits. It's going to get knocked around, it's going to get smashed by stuff, and it's going to show up as just crumbs. So we're going to have to melt it down and then pour it back into our own mold with it. So as we go through to build that, that's what goes into it too. We start looking at the structural specifications. What is it that we need this to do, maintain, based upon what we know is going to happen with this? Manufacturing, packaging, to ship it to whoever is going to be the salesperson, and then for them to ultimately put it on the shelf and have that product be sold and then transported to wherever it is going to. So there's a lot more to think about as we go in there. And then we start looking at the functional data. In this case, we're going to go through and we're really going to start looking at what's there. We will do studies with this. So when we go through and we create package design, you're going to study the stuff. What works, what doesn't work. We go through and start looking at things. Who's it designed for, demographics-wise? So we go through and start to play with that. If you're designing something that you don't want kids to get into, what's the tamper resistance that's built into it?
You put the explicit sign.
Right, because as soon as you print that explicit sign on it, kids never can get to it.
And it does sell, and
Amazing.
some people say it does sell more. It does sell more with the explicit on it. Since everyone's like, oh, this is new. I want to hear it. And there's
So, but when we go through, we start looking at stuff, and we start talking about tamper resistance, we start talking about kids getting into stuff. We talk about pill bottles. You have the pill bottles that are universal. So everybody familiar with those? You get the one that it goes on one way, you turn it, it clicks.
Yeah.
Kids can't open them. But then if you take the cap and you flip it over the other way, it'll still screw on there, but that's designed then for the elderly. So it doesn't actually lock, so you don't have to push down to get it to release. You can actually, it just twists off normal, regular threads to it. So as you start to think about that, what happens to there? So that is it's wider on one side than it is on the other. So one usually goes on the outside of the bottle, the other one will screw to the inside of the bottle. And then with that, when you flip it over for the elderly, it's larger, so they don't have to grip down, move their hands down as much, and are able to go through and open them. And then also as we go through, we start looking at it, what's the text you're going to have on there. So we go in and we start talking about copy. That's what we're talking about. What are we dealing with? What text going to be on there? How much information has to go on there as well. What's that?
So copy means.
Copy means text.
Oh, I thought you meant like the ease of copying.
So you can go through and talk about the ease if you want to get into how quickly, if we go back and we start thinking about it from printing specs and that, we can go in there and we can talk about, how easy is it to reproduce something? What's the mechanical process of it? So if you're dealing with something that's metal based, what happens to cut metal? What do you need to cut metal? Versus what do you need to go in and cut cardboard if you're using cardboard for it? When we go through, we start thinking about copy, we start talking about the text and everything that's available that's going to actually go into it as well. So we get into our package design considerations. You're going to have a process that you're going through. You're going to start to think about what is it that we need to have available to us. Now what's going to happen with it is ultimately it's going to be you, it's going to be your design team, it's going to be the client, it's going to be anybody else that they have inside of there that's actually going to go ahead and meet to discuss what is the overall scope of it. So what are your goals of it? Are we going in and we looking at the design? Is this just for a single product? Does it go out into, or is it going to branch out into multiple products? So if you go back to Coke, is it just for Coke? Or is this for Coke and Diet Coke? Or is this for Coke, Coke Zero, and Cherry Coke? Like, what are we doing with this? Where are we going? What is the overall scope? Or how far is this ultimately going to expand out into? But just like anything else, we do have to conduct research. Some of you may have been like, oh, I got to be a designer. I don't want to do research. But we do research. And with that, I think that there's a lot of fun stuff when we get into the research and begin to work with, because research, what's that?
What's an audit? I forget.
An audit is when you go back and evaluate everything that's there. So think like a financial audit, they go back and review all of your financial records and everything to make sure that things are running like they are supposed to.
So audit, so market and competitive audits
So they'll go back through and yes, they'll look at what's happening, what have you been doing, where have you been placing products? And by placing those products in that location, what has been your return on investment or your ROI? So when we go through and we start looking at that, so with the research, we're looking at research based on products themselves. We will be looking at, and that's where the audit, when we talk about audits there. So with that research, we're going back and looking at what have we been doing for marketing of the product? How did that work out for us? What are our competitors doing, and how is that impacting both our brands and their own brands? Now, can you get information from it? Depending on what you have, there's regulatory filings and things like that that you can dig into to really pull up what other people are generating. So as they go through and they submit all the required documents for what would be in any type of public held organization, that's the other challenge. Are you still in the public sector dealing with stuff that's held by shareholders, so it's a public organization? If you have a fully private company, it's a little bit harder to locate some of the materials related to what they have for those marketing and competitive analysis. Yes?
When it says set strategy, does it mean set a strategy or strategy that has been set?
So when you start talking about your brand positioning, the set strategy is a strategy that you have determined that you are approaching. So we go through and start looking at those audits. You're going to be looking at everything: products, placement, who are we targeting, what magazines that we've chosen, what's the primary purpose of those magazines, who's primarily reading them. You can get into subscription data, because once you start putting things in the magazines, you'll be amazed at how much information the magazine actually will provide to you based upon who actually buys their magazine, subscribers versus purchasers in store. That's because that's all information that they want you to have, because it, to them, of course, bolsters the fact that you should be using their magazine to push out what you have for products. So we go and we start looking at that, what's there. Really look at what's the competition doing. Well, why all of a sudden is the competition, why are they making a lot more than us? Why is their stuff flying off the shelves and ours aren't? Why is it I can go into the store and there's certain brands of ramen that you can't find them, they're not in there? Is it just because everyone's buying them, or is it because they're not producing them? There's a lot of things we have to look at when we go through and we start to evaluate and scrutinize who our competition is. Is if they're only making 50% of what we are and ours stay on the shelf and theirs don't, well, okay, is this a situation where people want theirs more than ours, or is it just the fact that we're making more volume so everybody's buying the same amount of each one, but since we produce twice as much, that's why some of ours is still on the shelf. So really go through and start to look at that and continue to focus on who your target audience is and really understand what it is that they're looking for, what they need. They used to buy your product and all of a sudden they're no longer buying your product. Why? Why did they move to the competition? There's got to be something there as to why they went there. You know, if you've gone in and you tweaked your flavor a little bit, and it has happened. Companies that have gone in and made slight adjustments to the flavor, all of a sudden their sales just plummet. It's because the people who are those traditionalists, those truists, notice that there's a change and they jump and go find something else to fill that void. So really make sure you're focusing on what's going on with it, understanding your target audience, understanding what's happening with it. So you're really going through and you're looking at the target audience, you look at the competition, and then you have those audits that they talk about, going back in and really looking at those to see how they are impacting it. When you go through and you start to design packaging, make sure you're clarifying what is your brand's position. So are we going for functional benefits? This is going to make you healthier. Or are we going for emotional benefits that you're just going to feel better if you go through and you take this? You know, there's certain things when we get into stuff and we start looking at things that people get addicted to. They get addicted to them usually because of the emotional benefits. Most things that are addictive are not done to have an actual functional benefit. It's an emotional pull to it. So we go through and start to look at that. You know, you drink coffee because you feel better, you feel more alert. The whole fact of what coffee ultimately goes through and does, you know, as a stimulant, and that really what it gets down to is you become addicted to that stimulating high that you get from drinking the coffee. Now, as you go through and start to choose the things, you choose those, yes. I mean, when you start looking at food, you choose food because when we go through and we choose a certain food, we know that if we eat that, we're going to feel better. But we also choose food because I'm not going to be hungry as soon. So therefore, we go through and we look at it from the standpoint that it may have both functional and emotional benefits. But really starting to think about that and what are we pushing with this. The brand personality. All of your brands have some sort of personality to them. So we go through and we start to think about it. You know, like Red Bull. You know, what do they push? It's going to give you wings. You know that Red Bull also then goes through, of course, their sponsorships. They choose to sponsor those high energy activities. So we start to think about how do those all go and play into that, and then what features are involved with the product you have, and then also what is the set strategy. So what have you defined to be the strategy for this product that you go through and make? Yes.
Red Bull's fairly well known for like that unique art style that they use in their advertisements and stuff. And obviously the slogan Red Bull.
Right, but the thing with it is the push with it is it goes in there. Like I said, a lot of what they push though is the focus on the high energy, the fact that they're extreme. And you look at what all they sponsor. I mean, everything's extreme. They go
Really,
into-
Red Bull, they support like some of like the tournaments for like leaders, like fighting games.
It's a drive because they do the stuff that's, oh well, you're gonna drink Red Bull to keep you up all night. You know, the old joke about, oh, you're an artist and you sit in your parents' basement on the computer drinking nothing but Mountain Dew. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that plays into it, but we look at what's the strategy. What do they have set for you to go through and do, and how does this actually support that set strategy? Now we get into package design. We have the psychological factors that come into package design. Now some people will sit there and may start to talk about, well, what exactly are the psychological impacts of it? Well, what ends up happening to it is like a lot of us are drawn to certain packages simply because of our emotional connection to it against what it is with the rational side of it. So when we go through and we start looking at it, we're not looking at the standpoint of, price and ingredients. It's our connection to it. What's the difference between going and getting a coffee at Starbucks versus Tim Hortons? $1.50, right? I mean, when you go down and you start to look at it, though, that's the thing we get into. People choose it, though, because of essentially how it makes them feel by going there. So what happens with that is we go through and we start to look at it. This is mentioned on here. We let people transfer their perception of a package to the product it contains. So with that, we have this sensation transference. So what are we talking about here? Well, we go through and start to look at it. Is that if the package looks elegant, what do we think about the product that's inside of it? It's elegant. So if you go through and you start looking at, one of the prime areas, and it's one of the things that's part of the project even for this week, for this session, is we start thinking about chocolate. Chocolate that's in fancy wrappers and stuff like that, we deem to be fancier chocolates, right? No? You guys think it's that like a Hershey's bar is way better than Godiva chocolates?
It's usually a combination of like both how the packaging looks and like how the brand like logo and stuff looks like as well.
Right.
Like Ghirardelli and Lindt, I think it's pronounced.
Lindt. Yep.
And that stuff, Godiva, like you mentioned. They have like more fancy kind of logo.
Right. And that's exactly what happens with it, though. So what we do with it is because of the way the packaging looks, which includes the logo design and everything, the way the packaging looks, we immediately look at it and say, "Whoa, that packaging is really fancy, so therefore the chocolate's got to be so much better."
I mean, the chocolate is really good from those brands.
But how much of that has to do with the fact that you're seeing the packaging and you spent $3.50 for this one piece of chocolate, How much of that is fully psychological? So if we went through and we started doing blind testing and stuff like that, what you'll start to see is that in most cases, and I always use that term, most cases, we could probably go through and I could bring chocolate from, the cheapest place where you buy the $1 candy bar, all the way up to the expensive stuff where you're going to spend, $10 for a candy bar. And most people aren't going to recognize any difference between what's in it from a chocolate standpoint. Most people.
Because isn't like most chocolate just the same thing, just it's a different style for
So, I mean, you look at it, there's a lot of stuff that's balancing out, what you have for the cocoa content versus the other ingredients that are inside of there to really go through and play with it. But what it ultimately comes down to is that we see things as the package is the product. So as a designer, you have to remember that if we go through and we start to look at it, the package is the product. We talk a lot about that even in design when we get into like logo design. The downfall with it is you yourself, as the logo designer, can design the best logo in the world, and if the company is garbage, what do people think about your logo? It's garbage. They see your logo and they're like, again, it's garbage.
Yeah, it's just like, it's some people being like, oh, I won't support this company because they did this to a certain thing, or they support this person who did something bad.
There's things like that, but typically when you get into the boycott situations, boycotts have minimal impact on stuff unless you really do something that is
I was just
contrary to what the whole popular belief is and stuff.
I was just like laughing my butt off when I found out like it was like the beginning of when Russia and Ukraine had like are at the war, and everyone's like leaving Russia, like a bunch of companies, and then like McDonald's and like Coca-Cola didn't, and then everyone on like Twitter was like, I'm boycotting McDonald's, they don't leave Russia, and I'm like, oh no.
And then it actually weirdly works. I'm like,
Well,
wow.
there's a lot of things that go through when you start to look at it. It takes a lot to get a shift in what's happening with stuff. But really, what's happening with this is we're designing a package, and the package in this case is going to go through and talk about the product. So the advantage that we have with this is we design this great package. All of a sudden, people think it's the best product in the world. People are buying the product. We're selling more, and now all of a sudden, yes, we as the package designers have the capability of pushing the product. Like I said, in logo design, the company is fully in charge of what happens to the logo. You can be the best logo in the world, but if the company's garbage, the logo is going to be seen as garbage. So when we go through and start to think about it, remember the package is the product. People are going to see that, they're going to automatically connect to it. The psychology of the fact that how nice this package looks, they open it like, oh, it's like the best chocolate I've ever had. And you're like, oh yeah, right. All I did was put fancy wrapping on that. It's really just a Hershey's bar. I melted it down and I put it into that shape. I melted it and wadded it up like a ball and called it a truffle, and everybody loves it. So when we go through, we start to look at that's what's there. So we talked about the aesthetics. How does that package actually look? Really driving through what's inside of there. So if it's a nice, neat package, we've gone through and we've thought about the process for it, and it's really elegant and it's fancy as we go through and work with it. We look at the lint you pull on the sides, it's rolled up in it. What's that package versus, a regular plain package to it. So as we start to think about that, as we go through and we build that, we add in there, what are the colors we choose? Why do we choose those colors? Why is it gold? The argument I go back to is, Hershey's always worked with silver, and then I know that they use gold with their almond one, but Hershey bars have silver, so then other companies started using gold. Gold's more valuable than silver.
Yeah.
So they start pushing that from a product standpoint to go through and do that. So as we go through and start to look at what's happening with this, know that they say that between 65 and 75% of our decisions are ultimately made while we're standing in that store looking at the packaging. So when you're walking down there and you're like, let's see, I need some spaghetti sauce. They're all in jars, but you're looking at them all. There's two ways you typically look at it. Oh, look at the jar that's got the fancy label, gets your attention, or you're just strictly looking at the prices. If you're strictly looking at the prices, then the packaging probably has minimal impact on there, just because of that. But we are looking at the packaging, and so I would go through and look and go, oh, this one here looks really good. I grab that one.
It's like weirdly enough, there's like different countries have like different packaging. Like for example, for milk, us in the USA, we have in like our cartons and then like the plastic like containers. Canada, they have them in bags.
Yeah, and that comes into play too. If you start looking at what are the areas in which you're working on, where is this going to be distributed? That distribution, what are certain standards that are there? That's where you get into the stuff. I mean, yeah, milk in the U.S. is half gallon, gallon. A lot of people are going to buy it in a plastic jug, or you may be buying it in a carton. It just really depends on what you have. So that goes into play as well. But the packaging is what's going to make or break the sale. That's how you get the attention of it, and then they look at it and go, oh, this one looks really good. Only on the back, you look really small, it says this is wadded up Hershey's candy bars. So we go through and start to look at that. So we get into those design factors, color. So as we go through and we ultimately choose our color, what's going to happen with this is how do we go through and start to relate that back? So we look at that from key associations. We look at it from a color standpoint for flavor. So we go through and we start to choose stuff, what's happening with that, or even fragrance choices. So if I went in there and I'm like, yeah, I got this thing. It's a Hershey's bar and it's got red on it. What comes to mind? Cherry, strawberry. If you see something, it's a drink, it's a flavored drink, and it's got purple on it. What do you think? Grape. It's got orange on it. Orange. So as you go through, you start to think about that. There's colors that come in there that you start to use. I don't know how many of you were even around to know what was one product that they tried to change color of that did not work.
What?
I'm sure this is a case where I might know what it
There was
is.
a well-known product that they went through and they changed the color of it.
Like the color of the packaging or the color of the product itself?
Color of the product itself. And it led into packaging as well. And sales, I don't know what the sales would have been on, but it's no longer around. And I know other people that were just like, nope, can't do it.
Just put my head right around the confused Jackie Chan meme. I'm confused.
So if you look, they went in and they did colored ketchup. As in like green ketchup. I think they even did like purple ketchup. And even I think the whole standpoint on it, and this has been a while ago, standpoint on it was that kids would want to use it. And the problem with it was kids wouldn't even, because the psychological side of it is like, this is not ketchup. It's going to taste just like ketchup, but it is not ketchup.
It looks like slime.
And I'm pretty sure they did a green and they did a purple ketchup. I think those are the only two colors though.
Why?
I just remember when Burger King tried it, or no, IHOP did the IHOP thing.
Oh yeah,
That's when
I thought they were actually doing it, but I think it was an April Fool's joke.
I just think it's funny that this slide uses 3 different liquids in succession to tell you that color can help differentiate flavors and scents.
Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't it an April Fool's joke?
The first one talks about it as a design element. The second one talks about differentiating and choices, and then the other one down below talks about cueing people. So yeah, it goes through and talks about how important color's a major role in it. But that's the thing that we get into. So the ketchup is a prime example where attempting something from a psychological standpoint, color drives home the fact that this is ketchup.
It's forever has to be red. It's a different color.
It-
and it's not that good. Like
Well,
there is a
it doesn't taste any different. I did try it, but it's still weird to sit there and be like,
When did this
I'm
happen?
gonna dip. I don't know what the year is on it.
okay. So
I know it was a long time ago.
Like, for
but I just
example-
remember when it hit the stores, and I was like, no, like who's gonna put purple ketchup on stuff?
Oh, 2000.
really,
Yeah.
you looked that up? I wasn't even born in 2000. That's fine.
Right. I'm just saying, but there's the conversation with it. And I know other like that it just comes up. It's a key. It's a prime thing we go back through though. We start looking at going in there and doing research. It's something that was there that just didn't work.
This was a promotion of the first Shrek movie.
I didn't remember why it was out. I just know they pushed it,
Oh,
and
for the love of
I like I said, I tried the green. I never tried the purple. I tried the green.
Let
And
me
yes,
guess, green flavor
it
was like-
tastes just like ketchup. But psychologically, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. So
Like the green one was like, it was like ogre, like
I wanted it to taste like lime or something. I don't know.
Or relish, is like lime.
So as we go through and start to work with it, just know that that's the thing that starts to play into it. We start dealing with colors, another area with it. Color differentiates choices. So again, flavors and scents, but also color can unify the line. So you may have to go in there and sit and think about, okay, I'm using red because red's my main product. I have these other scents and stuff with that, but red's the main product. How am I going to differentiate those by maintaining red on the package, but still showing that there's different flavors and that to it? The other thing, and this is where, like I said, I think I had the hardest problem when we start talking about the different colors of ketchup, is that it plays a major role in cueing you as flavor. So when you go through and you see something, so we're not talking about necessarily even a packaging right now, we're talking about the fact that you see something, you see this pile of green stuff on your plate, I'm willing to bet that if I put down and said, oh, just dip your fries in it, you're like, what is this? Just dip your fries in it, you like it. You have this all the time, you're like, no, I've never dipped my fries in green stuff. And then you go through and you have it, you realize then the flavor comes into there. So that's something that still is, we play off of, and that's still part of the psychological side of it. So we choose those, we color them. The US, there's a lot of colors that we use for food that are actually illegal in other countries. They
Like,
cannot add that.
why?
What's that?
Why? Can you say some examples? Because
I mean, the amount that we have, like the yellow coloring and red colorings that are on there. We had coloring too stuff. Does everyone know that maraschino cherries start as being red, and then through the process they become white, and after they get done processing them into maraschino cherries, they add red coloring back to them so they go back to red? Because their concern is that people, especially here in the US, would not eat a cherry that was white. Even though it has the exact same flavor. So there's colors that we add back in. I don't remember what the ones are exactly, but there's like yellow number 5, red number 2, whatever they are. There are certain ones though that you can't find anywhere else. I mean, you'll get mac and cheese, and the mac and cheese won't be yellow because what they use to make it would be white. So they just leave it that way in other countries. But here in the U.S., they add coloring back into the powder for Kraft mac and cheese so that it'll be yellow because that's what's expected. So there's a lot of stuff that gets added into there that provides nothing to it except for color. Because there's the problem, the fact that psychologically we're not going to eat something that's that color because we don't associate back the flavor to it. So we're used to cheese, and you may grow up on the whole basis that cheese is yellow. I was amazed at one point I got American cheese, and my kids looked at it, and then I got white American cheese. Like, that's not the cheese we usually get. I'm like, it's American cheese. It just isn't yellow. Tastes exactly the same, but just isn't yellow. So there's things like that that go into it. So color plays a major thing with that. And then we look at the last one about color, talking about status or quality. So we go through and we start looking at that. Why did you choose that color? Oh, because it makes me, specifically in this area. And if you see somebody driving a pink car, what do you immediately associate them to?
Barbie?
Well, you could associate them to Barbie. But who
see women driving.
who provides? I will tell you right now, you'll struggle to find a pink car that isn't either A, custom painted, or B, was gifted to that person by Mary Kay. Mary Kay Cosmetics. When you get to a certain level, you get to select a car, and it is at Mary Kay paint. Go on to the car dealership. How many people have walked onto any car dealership and found a pink car for sale that wasn't custom painted? Never. They don't make them. They just don't make them. They don't exist. So with that, I should say that they don't exist. You might find some high-end car manufacturer out there that does make a pink car off the factory. But you go to your GMs, your Fords, your Dodge, your Chrysler, all of them, Fiat, BMW, you're probably, I'm willing to bet, a donut that you're not going to find somebody who has a factory color that is pink, that they regularly send off the floor. Could they have one that would be an upgrade choice? Possibly. But you're just not going to find it. So when you go through and you start to see it, that pink car, you either know that the person paid to have it custom painted, or they're driving the Mary Kay car. So when we go through and start to think about it, there is a status to that. So what are you choosing? The gold accents. You know, start looking at what you're choosing for materials that are in it. Those all drive into what is there. The other thing we have in here is dealing with images. So we start looking at the imagery or the illustrations that actually are on there. They also go through to convey information to you and also create then some sort of emotional connection to that object. So this is why when we start looking at movies come out and all of a sudden you start to see them, you know, put on packaging. Anybody order anything, got anything from Amazon recently in one of their small boxes? Anybody? Just me? I got multiple ones I just threw into recycling. So the Hotel Transylvania movie is now, they have it printed on the boxes, so all the little boxes are coming out because of course it's being streamed via Amazon Prime. So it's on Prime Video. So they're pushing that out there to get you to watch it because of course when you watch it, they get money. So now it's all printed on the boxes, so they're pushing that out there, so it's everywhere with that. So what they're really looking at though is they're choosing these people and these things to be on it to, of course, to get you to react to it. And then we start looking at typography. What's the type that you're choosing? What are you choosing the way it looks? What are you trying to tell us? So how are you trying to communicate us? Both directly, so denotated in the sense that from a dictionary standpoint of I want this, the connotated for us putting it into a context to understand that this is exactly what is going on with it. So we go through and we start to work with the products, the information, and everything with that. Yes?
So I looked it up and apparently Volkswagen had a limited edition fuchsia pink colored Beetle back in 2016.
So limited edition, what's limited edition mean?
Faster.
Money. So the goal with that, and that's what it pushes off of, is that it does, when you see certain things like that, it pushes on the fact of that we're looking at, you know, your status symbol, the cost of it that's going on. So, like I said, and there, you probably, if you went in there and look, you might even find other places that have specific colors like that that you can go through and choose. I don't know, Bugatti might have you might be able to choose a pink Bugatti. I don't know, I haven't shopped for a Bugatti recently. I don't know about anybody else. Anybody else shop for one recently? No? Okay. If you did, I was like, cool. How'd it go? But we start looking at the visual hierarchy. So we start looking at focusing in on what's the main part of it. There's a lot of products that we go through that we recognize the actual name of it. Because they've gone through, they stylized the name. And that's the whole purpose of it. They're not just choosing a regular text and putting it on it. Now, could you, we played around at one point a long time ago on what would happen if you took like standard products in the store and we took the packaging idea completely away. Packages have no name to them, and we just put their title in Helvetica. So you walk down the cereal aisle, and every box in the cereal aisle was a white box, and just in Helvetica across it, it says Cinnamon Toast Crunch, Cheerios, Captain Crunch. And you had to walk through there, and you picked out the product. What would happen with that? Would it change anything based upon what people go through and ultimately purchase? And it will. It'll have an impact on them because you no longer have that connection because the title that's there, the images that are on those packages are what you're used to seeing. It's like anything. You go through and I start to name things off. I started going through cars. I said Ford. All of you had an image pop into your head, whether it's the blue oval, whether it's a specific vehicle, pops into your head because that's what you've built over your life to associate to Ford. You know, if they say, you know, talk about, you know, Chevy, the same thing. So if I go through and I say cereal, everybody pictures in their head the cereal that they would choose to eat. If I sit there and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna buy everybody a case of pop, whatever it is that you drink. Boom, there's one that immediately pops into your head, and what you're picturing is you're picturing the product. You're not picturing, by product I mean the package of the product. You're not sitting there thinking, oh, Mountain Dew, and you're picturing, I'll call it fluorescent drink inside the glass, yellow really, but, or if I say, Coke, you don't just see brown liquid sitting in a glass, you picture the package of what it is that you're going to be eating. Because that's how we go through and we start to build all of that in. So that's what's there. So we start talking about what we're choosing for the typographic elements, the visuals, so the photography or the illustrations. Those are key things. That's how we enter into that product. As we go through, we start to look at how do we naturally move through the stuff. Do we go through and hit the product name first, and then we move down to the other stuff? So we hit the first part of the Cinnamon Toast Crunch, and we move down to the bowl, with the spoon in it, with the Cinnamon Toast Crunch in there, with the milk and that, and then we read on to other areas of it. So when we go through and we start to look at it, is that we're ensuring an order to it. When we start talking about being in logical order, we're really talking about with logical order would be just naturally how we would flow through what it is that we are looking at. So really think about how you place the things on there, what's going to ultimately happen with that. With this we go and we start talking about, with it, it's set this for Old Spice. Old Spice needed to shake a musty reputation. So we started thinking about Old Spice with this. If you go back a little while ago, with that, it was always Old Spice, old people. And that's really what it went down to. People use Old Spice to cover up the smell of death because of, they're just old people that are
Or
dying.
like nowadays, Old Spice can you cover yourself in Old Spice and women go crawling for
Right.
it.
So that's what they went after. So with that, they were focusing on pushing it away from essentially Old Spice meaning old to Old Spice going to mean manliness. So that's what he talks about on here. So go through there, focus on a new audience, but of course celebrating the manliness. So the fresh packaging and unique voice, irreverent and masculine, made the brand appeal to a younger audience. So they did. There's a big shift in what happened with it. The whole focus on the outdoors themes, and like I said, it's just Old Spice. It just smells like somebody who's rugged and rich. So that's what they went after, as opposed to Old Spice, smelling like people that are about to die. So we go through and we start to look at what's happening with the brand packaging. What are we doing with this? Where are we bringing it to? So they got rid of the old red dispenser. Which was an old red dispenser with a really basic label on it that just didn't have a whole lot of life to it. So they've really broke it down. And here we start to see what's happening. The label themselves would have never had all of this nice ornament behind here to give us the image of something else. It literally was basic and just simply said Old Spice. So as we start to look at what can happen with that, it has gone in and certainly has revitalized Old Spice from the standpoint of reaching a whole new audience and impacting a whole new audience with it. You go there and you start to look at anything packaging wise that has a long history. Look at how their packaging has shifted throughout the years, and you start to see what's going on with the movements with it. There for a while, packaging was really ornamental, and it moved through and it got more simplified, and now we're starting to go away from that. We're going back out to what I say call ornamental, meaning there's additional things that are added to it. It's not straightforward and we ran out of any place that we can really think of. So we go through, we start to design it. We need to go through and we design appropriately. So really thinking about what's the relevance of the product, what's the relevance overall of the brand, and ultimately how is this going to go towards that target audience. He said Old Spice took a shift from their normal audience, and those are the people they started with. Those people used Old Spice all the way up, and now those people are in their 60s and 70s. They're like, well, wait a minute now. We've got to go in there, we've got to really pop this up somewhere else. So they reinvigorate the brand to bring it back to a younger audience to expand out what is there. Now with that, they're not most likely going to lose their most ardent supporters. If you think about your items that you always get, you still regularly get, as their packaging has changed, the look of it has changed, and that, has it lost you? Most likely not. If you are with that brand, have been using that brand, you're going to continue to use that brand unless something else comes in or something else maybe disappears, harder to get. And that's been kind of the shift that started to happen a little bit when COVID came on, even right now with all of the supply chain issues is that people are being forced to use different products than they usually would use because what they usually get is just not available there and available anywhere else. Yes?
When it says determine cues, do you mean like visual cues as to the brand, what the brand is?
Yeah, you're determining what things are going to cue you in and bring you into that. So when we go through, we start to look though at our products, how is it that we ultimately end up with different things? Sometimes, like I said, we just can't get them. That's really what's going on with the COVID, and like I said, the whole thing with supply chain management is that we're losing the stuff, so we're being forced to use something else, and that may stick. Also, when we go through, consider how it's going to fit into everything else. So if we go back, we start to think about the Old Spice here. Really, we have the container itself. The other containers are all pretty common, pretty standard, same type of mechanism to them. But as we go through, we start to think about it, how is it going to work with each of these side by sides? And you see how the whole series there on the bottom works with one another and keep things that are going to be consistent. We go through, make sure it has impact shelf or screen. So when we go through, we start to use it. We start to think about what's going to happen with this as we use an image of it. To give it full size, also think about it when we scale things down. We want to make sure the smallest that we use it, it's recognizable, and the largest that we use it, it will also still be recognizable as well. What are you going to do to differentiate from the competition? Now with that, there are limitations. You can't, with certain products, there's an expectation of the design of the carrying package. If that's the case, then the challenge of differentiation has to come into the design of what's going onto it. If we go through and we start to look at it from a standpoint of the package itself, what can we do with the package to make it stand out? Here you go into candy bars. What's the shape of the Toblerone package? It's a triangle. So when you go through and start to think about that, what's the difference between the impact of that versus just simply going with a rectangular box? So there's ways we can differentiate ourselves, so we can go through and we can start to use that, and then we can build off of what is there. Ensure identification. Maintain certain things that your audience is going to expect to see on there. If you go through and you completely change the look and the feel of it, people are going to struggle to find it. And then when people are typically using the product, who know what they're looking for, can't find it, that's when they're going to go over and they're going to be forced to use something else because they're not finding what is there. So with that, you can also communicate that out. How do you tell your audience if there is going to be a big change to the packaging? What is it you sell out to your audience to make sure that they're aware of that? And then determine as you go through, as you start to design it, what are the cues that people are ultimately looking for to go through and find your individual package. Make sure that the colors that you're choosing associate back to the product. A lot of times what we start to find with it is that what we choose for a packaging color relates directly to a color with the product. What color, if we start talking about Hershey's bars, cookies and cream, what color is the packaging? Yeah, so there's white, there's blue, and then you'll of course have the chocolate that's still on there as well. So those are colors that they're choosing based upon, of course, the cream idea comes over, and that's where you see the lighter packaging. So as you start to choose stuff, what's there? How are we going through and ultimately associating that into it? Make sure that any information that's going on there or that you're trying to communicate to people is clear and legible. You're trying to talk about this is a benefit, a health benefit of it, make sure that that's clear to them, how it's a health benefit to them. We don't want to go in, and our goal isn't to muddle the waters unless, of course, you're talking about things that are supposed to be dietary, and then that's the difference between light, L-I-T-E, and light, L-I-G-H-T, versus diet, versus what happens with low carbs, low calorie, all these things that come into there. What are they using to go in and use what is there? Make sure as you go through and start to work with it, we're working with things to coordinate the efforts so that we have a unified approach as we go through. We start to look at what's changing on there. So if there's a change in a flavor, if there's a change in a product, there's different choices, variations in the product line themselves, making sure that we are staying consistent as we go all the way through each of them. Look at the shelf context. So we go through and we start to see multiple on display. What's going to happen with that? How can we see what's there? How can we work with those? How can we understand those items as well? Okay, you're right. As we go in and we start to look at the stuff, knowing that things may be seen on a screen. So we start to think about things going onto a screen, what's there, online shoppers as a prime spot. So what is going to be the orientation or the view of it that they're going to be able to see on the screen. We start to look at things, making sure that the visual appeal is effective. So as we go through, we start to work with the designs. Where is it going to? Is it going to function where we are placing it? The big thing I can't stress enough with anything is materials. Go out and work with materials. As you work with materials, what works, what doesn't work. So think about different even weights of paper. The difference in the types of cardboard that are out there. Poster boards. We start looking at filaments. So we start looking at plastics, foils. Really go out there and experiment with things. Don't be afraid to play with things like that. Understand a bit about the design process along with the printing process. So we're choosing these things. How are we ultimately going to print on them? How are we going to go in and ultimately make these work? Start to think about what can you use material-wise as well when we start looking at what's non-toxic. So we look at that breakdown period, that just works its way back into sustainability as well. So we start to really look at how are we going through and choosing those and working with those processes. Now as we get in and we begin to work with designing, the challenge that we get into package design, as I mentioned, is that this is something that's going to go in and become a three-dimensional form. However, when we think about it from a 2D standpoint, there's a few different ways in which 2 dimensions come into it. The first one is that when we go through and we design this, how is it going to be printed first off? Flat. Because it's going to be a single print that's flat that ultimately is going to get folded up into a three-dimensional form. So with that, while yes, we are going through and we're looking at it three-dimensionally from a structural standpoint, we are still designing it. It's still going to be a two-dimensional design. It's going to be a flat design when we start with it. But we go through, we start talking about the form. So we talked about the form. We're talking about, is it going to be a bottle? Is it going to be a carton? Is it a jar? Is it tin? Is it a wrapper? Is it a bag? What is it that it's actually going to go into? What form is it going to take? With that form, what are we making it out of? We know that we have glass bottles, we have plastic bottles, we have paper bottles. So we go through and we start to think about what are we going to ultimately use for the material, how does that play into it? When we get into playing with it, then we have to start to think about how are we ultimately going to be finishing up the product. If it's a glass bottle, are we actually printing on the glass? Are we printing it on a label that's going to be adhered to it? Are we going through and we're printing it on something that's going to drop down onto it, and then instead of it just being a regular label that glues and wraps, does it drop down onto it and then it moves past an area at one point that hits heat to it and it shrink wraps down onto it? So we really have to start to think about all of these things that go into that overall process to go in and finish what is there. If we're putting it onto a shelf, how are we seeing that? As we look at it, we're naturally seeing just, of course, one dimension of it. So are we seeing, I shouldn't say one dimension, one side of it, because you're still seeing a height and a width. But one side of it, flat, is kind of how we're envisioning that. So how is that going to look on there? If your package gets turned a little bit, what happens? What happens if the package gets put on the shelf and we only see the end of it? We talked about that with book jackets and book covers. Is we may only see the spine. So if we put the bottle up there and the bottle's rotated 90 degrees, and we're not seeing just the name of it, are we going to be able to identify that as the product? So really think about that. And then the other thing with it is if somebody picks that up and is carrying it, what's happening with that? What are we seeing? What might the audience see with that? So really go in there and get a hold of things and say, well, if I pick this up, what happens to it? I pick it up and I do this, what happens to that? So really start to think about what happens from a 2D standpoint as we go through and pick that up. When you design the graphics, think about everything. Because we don't know how it's going to ultimately be on the shelf. Yes, it's ideally it's up there, it's turned, it's rotated the way we want it to be seen. But we all know people go in and they pick something up like, oh wait, nope, I don't want that anymore. And they put it up there and all of a sudden it's turned 20 degrees.
There's also with books, you're like, oh, you have this beautiful cover on it, but then they just place on the shelf, and you're like, oh, you just use it.
Right. Well, and that's because it's the environment. So it's like with book covers, they go on there, they may be in there, so we're seeing the spine, or maybe flat to where we see the front. But what happens when somebody picks it up and turns it around and we see the back? Same thing goes into a package design. So we can start thinking about what's going to happen when it gets put on the shelf. What are those surfaces that are there? What are people going to see? How are we going to identify that as our package? Environmental context. Everything around it plays into it. Difference between it being on the top shelf, being on the bottom shelf. How's the light hit it? How are we going to gain your attention to something? If it's on the bottom shelf, now imagine if your package uses dark colors, let's say Berea pasta. Instead of it being up at eye level, it gets put on the bottom. It's dark blue. How much attention is a dark blue package going to get on the bottom shelf? That's down at being black and white. Right, it's dark. So we have to be aware of what's going on, where it's going at, location it's going into, where it might end up on the shelf. Be aware of that because that's the environmental characteristics of it. Does it stand out or does it not? Does it blend in? If it blends in, then we're going to lose it. We start looking at imagery and information. Is it going across panels? So that means does it go from the side to the front or from the front to the side? You'll see images that wrap. Perfectly fine as long as, of course, we're still communicating what's going on with that. It's a major reason why when we go through and we start looking at packaging, you'll typically see you have the logo on the front, and then one of your side panels will typically still have the logo on it. Because that allows us to go in there from at least two perspectives there. So the front and one of the edges, the narrow edges, will have the logo. If it's all the way over on the back side, it's possible you're not going to know what it is. It's when we go to color identification, the package itself based on color. The fact that it's turned around, we still, knowing the aisle we're in that's the environmental context that we're dealing with, we relate that color back to this company, so boom, I can still find it. Once again, we could go and run a study and we could flip these things all around, we could run you down the cereal aisle, and you're still going to be able to find your cereal because you know what the back of the box looks like as well. So when we go and we start to work with it, know how are things going to work, making sure that we're still identifying the product itself to all of the panels. Come on. There it goes. So we get into sustainability. So we're
You skipped the third slide about looking at the
apparently a third slide doesn't exist.
That is weird.
So yeah, the third slide vanished. It wasn't sustainable. So with that, consider how the materials, what are we doing with the materials? Are we choosing something that's depleting something or polluting, stuff like that? You don't want to do that. In this day and age, everybody goes in there and that's the big fight with it. Everybody starts looking, most people start looking for things that are recyclable so that they can be reused. Yes.
What does refuse mean in that first bullet? I've never seen it as a noun before.
So no, in this case, it's add unnecessary refuse to it.
Refuse to like
Garbage.
trash,
Yes. So with this, we're adding unnecessary items to it. Like they're in there that has no function, has no addition to the form, doesn't support anything. It's just there and then it becomes garbage. So with that, why are we using it? Why are we tearing up that possible natural resource to go in and add nothing to it? So we go through and start to look at that. Why are we adding things? So when we start thinking about our materials, making sure that we can use them, they're not doing any damage to it. Everybody's looking for environmental friendly packaging. That's the push. The point that you even have now to-go containers that are compostable, so you don't even have to do anything with them. If you have a compost pile somewhere at the house, you can just throw it in there. And you think about the stuff from the farm. You actually could take them, and people talk about all the time, you can take it right out to your plant bed and just take it and tear it up and throw it in there, and all it does is just breaks down and goes in almost like a food source to what's there. Similar to what you can do with newspaper. It goes in there and allows it to hold moisture in and be used for growing. So we start looking at that. What are those environmental friendly materials that we might be able to incorporate into our package to allow this to go in and work better? So we're reducing things down. This is why we also see packages at tended to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Yes, some of them is because the product is reduced, but overall we start to see packages. People don't want to go in blister packs, for example. I've gotten to the point where there's very minimal amount of plastic used anymore. Used to be you'd have blister packs and the whole front of it would be plastic. But they've gone away from that to where now it's just a little insert with plastic and the rest of it's all recyclable cardboard. Because we're looking at the fact that we're trying to minimize how much is actually being used. So what are things that we can do to become eco-friendly? Well, like I said, use recyclable materials, things that can be recycled, things that have already been recycled, so that post-consumer use. And then we look at compostable organic materials. Those containers, like I said, that are compostable just as they sit. And with that, you can go ahead and put them in there. You realistically could take these containers and you could set it out in your front yard, and after about 2 rains, and they just start to completely break down to where there's nothing left of them. Look at energy. What goes into it? So we start thinking about what energy sources go into it. So to manufacture something, how much heat has to be generated, how much electricity is being used, things along those lines to go through and produce what's there and try to make them a lot more efficient. Then we start looking at pollution. So as we look at the manufacturing process, the materials themselves, and if something goes through and happens to it, what ultimately does it give off if it goes through and burns? Challenge we have right now, of course, is that most of the stuff that's in the things that we use regularly are all actually contain plastics. So we go through and we start burning things. This room caught on fire right now. The thing that's actually going to be most harmful to everything to us that's in here has nothing to do with the fire. Has nothing to do with the flame and the heat. It has to do with the toxic gas that's going to come off of this carpet burning. So as we start to look at stuff, know that as we go through and we start to build those, that's what happens to stuff. So what can we do to things, and how can we design stuff that are non-toxic? That they end up in the ocean, that they would dissolve away and not hurt anything. So looking at those things with it. So we go through and we start to think about the packages. We can look at these packages. We can see what's inside of here. This is your third slide. So we start to look at these. We start to think about the containers. What's there? What do we see? So Pangea Organics. What's happening with these packages? What are they choosing? How are we looking at them? Reusability, even to the point of being able to refill stuff. We don't do a whole lot of refillables anymore. But with that, what is that we can go in and ultimately work with on them? Then I talked into getting into something like audio package design. They talk about it from a CD standpoint, but really what we're looking at is we look at the cover artwork. What's the cover artwork communicating to you? There's a lot of times we go in and look at them. Some people say, well, the artwork really didn't go into have anything to do with the music. Well, it's supposed to be designed, or typically designed around what's the feeling. And a lot of this comes from the artists when you talk to them as to what is there. But it's serving 2 different functions, really, when we look at them. The cover artwork is either going after somebody that's new, saying, hey, you really should listen to this. And then they have other elements though that are on there where they're going, yep, that's what I would expect from them. And the person who listens to them all the time, you find them going in and listening to it as well. Now there may ultimately be different manufacturing techniques. Realistically though, it's not. It's still designed. The difference of the package is, does the package provide some other function to it? Or is the package strictly there to house and protect that CD, DVD, whatever it is that you're using for it? So we start thinking about that. A lot of times there's the artwork that goes into audio packages is really conceptual artwork. Somebody maybe have actually gone through and commissioned somebody to go in and draw it, design it, so it's completely fine art. you go back and start to look at it, there's a lot of CD covers that became posters that then people have hang on the walls. So it's more of a fine art basis than anything else. We go through and we start to look at stuff. So this here is looking at an interview with VP of Creative. So Michael Connor's here. So they said, if you were to give a speed workshop in designing brand experiences, what 5 points would you emphasize? So when you go through and you start to think about, okay, I'm working on something, I'm looking at a brand experience. The first off he talks about is that you want to go in and keep the user top of the mind at every step. So every time you go and you start to think about something, start to work on something, go back to that user. Go right back to them and say, okay, this is the person's using, this is what they're looking for, this is what they're looking for. Not what am I looking for, what's the user looking for? Because you may not be a user of the product. And you will. You'll work on stuff, you'll design stuff for products that you have no desire to use, you have no reason to use. So always keep the user at the top of the mind. Go beyond the obvious. So find that novel approach to it. Instead of saying, well, I'm going to put it in this because, well, you know, all candy bars are in this type of package, so I'm going to stick to that. No, find something new. Go beyond that. Use what you have personally, though, experience with it, or what you believe on that, as well as to start to drive into it. So there's a product you're like, yeah, I don't do that because this is what I think of it. Yeah, you know, I had no desire in buying one of those cars because I think everybody who drives is snobby and everything. You know, they drive with their nose stuck up in the air and everything else. And they think they own the road, so they drive in 1.5 lanes. And so start using your own personal perspective of it, and take your own gut onto how can you go through and play with those. Create something uniquely ownable. So something that's unique and that you can take ownership of. So think of Avis. With that, Avis, we try harder based on the fact that we're not number one. We recognize we're not number one. So since we're not number one, we try harder. So again, owning that place, what they go through, and they start to do with it. And then make sure people can feel your concept as much as they understand it. This goes back to the point, the psychology, the emotional thing with it. We go to things, we are drawn to things, we take things, we do things for the emotional benefit of it. And that goes all the way across the board. There's people that know that they shouldn't do something, but they do it because of how it makes them feel. So what can we do as designers, as package designers, to get people to purchase the product, to get so connected to stuff that our product, because of our package, has become a need. Beyond the want, it's a need. They need this to survive, when we know they really don't. They need this to survive based upon what we've gone in and done with it. And know that as you design the packages, as you work with the packages, that you ultimately are going to drive the consumer to consume something.